Stand with me, if you will, please, in honor of the Word of God as we are about to read this book. I know last week you were all so excited. It was the shortest chapter of the entire book, only 8 verses, and now we hit 59 verses. Leviticus chapter 13, starting with verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, When a man has on the skin of his body a swelling, a scab, or a bright spot, and it becomes on the skin of his body like a leprous sore, then he shall be brought to the Aaron, the priest, or to one of his sons, the priests. The priest shall examine the sore on the skin of the body, and if the hair on the sore has turned white, and the sore appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a leprous sore. Then the priest shall examine him and pronounce him unclean. But if the bright spot is white on the skin of his body and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and its hair is not turned white, then the priest shall isolate the one who has the sore 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day, and indeed, if the sore appears to be as it was, and the sore is not spread on the skin, then the priest shall isolate him another 7 days. Then the priest shall examine him again on the 7th day, and indeed, if the sore has faded, and the sore has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only a scab, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the scab has spread at all, if the scab should at all spread over the skin, after he has been seen by the priest for his cleansing, he shall be seen by the priest again. And if the priest sees that the scab has indeed spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. Verse 9, When the leprous sore is on a person, then he shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall examine him, and indeed if the swelling on the skin is white, and it has turned the hair white, and there is a spot of raw flesh in the swelling, it is an old leprosy on the skin of his body. The priest shall pronounce him unclean, and shall not isolate him, for he is unclean. And if leprosy breaks out over all the skin, and the leprosy covers all the skin of the one who has the sore from the head to his foot, wherever the priest looks, then the priest shall consider, and indeed, if the leprosy has covered all his body, he shall pronounce him clean. Who has the sore, it has all turned white, he is clean. But when the raw flesh appears on him, he shall be unclean. And the priest shall examine the raw flesh and pronounce him to be unclean, for the raw flesh is unclean, it is leprosy. Or if the raw flesh changes and turns white again, he shall come to the priest, and the priest shall examine him. And indeed, if the sore is turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. Who has the sore, he is clean. Verse 18, If the body develops a boil in the skin, and it is healed, and in the place of the boil there becomes a white swelling or a bright spot, reddish white, then it shall be shown to the priest. And if, when the priest sees it, indeed it appears deeper than the skin, and its hair has turned white, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous sore which is broken out of the boil. But if the priest examines it, and indeed there are no white hairs in it, and it is not deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the priest shall isolate him 7 days, and if it should at all spread over the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous sore. But if the bright spot stays in one place and has not spread, it is the scar of the boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Or, verse 24, Or if the body receives a burn on its skin by fire, and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a bright spot, reddish white or white, then the priest shall examine it, and indeed if the hair of the bright spot is turned white, and it appears deeper than the skin, it is leprosy broken out in the burn. Therefore the priest shall announce him unclean. It is a leprous sore. But if the priest examines it, and indeed, there is no white hairs in the bright spot, and it is not deeper than the skin, but has faded, and the priest shall isolate him 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day, and if it has at all spread over the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous sore. But if the bright spot stays in one place, and has not spread on the skin, but has faded, it is a swelling from the burn. The priest shall pronounce him clean, for it is a scar from the burn. Verse 29. If a man or woman has a sore on the head or the beard, then the priest shall examine the sore, and indeed it appears deeper than the skin, and there in it is a yellow hair, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a scaly leprosy of the head or beard. But if the priest examines the scaly sore, and indeed it does not appear deeper than the skin, there is no black hair in it, then the priest shall isolate the one who has the scale 7 days. And on the 7th day the priest shall examine the sore, and indeed if the scale has not spread, and there is no yellow hair in it, the scale does not appear deeper than the skin, he shall shave himself, but the scale he shall not shave. And the priest shall isolate the one who has the scale another 7 days. On the seventh day the priest shall examine the scale. And indeed, if the scale has not spread over the skin and does not appear deeper than the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. He shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the scale should at all spread over the skin after his cleansing, then the priest shall examine him, and indeed, if the scale has not spread over the skin, the priest need not seek for yellow hair, he is unclean. But if the scale appears to be at a standstill, and there's black hair growing up in it, the scale has healed, he is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Verse 38. If a man or woman has bright spots on the skin of the body, specifically white bright spots, then the priest shall look, and indeed, if the bright spots on the skin of the body are dull white, it is a white spot that grows on the skin, he is clean. And as for the man whose hair has fallen from his head, he is bald, but he is clean. I love that part personally. He who has hair has fallen from his forehead, he is bald in the forehead, but he is clean. And if there is bald head or bald forehead, a reddish white sore, it is leprosy breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead. Then the priest shall examine it, and indeed, if the swelling of the sore is reddish white on his bald head, or if on his bald forehead is the appearance of leprosy on the skin of the body, he is a leprous man, he is unclean. The priest shall surely pronounce him unclean, his sore is on his head. Now the leper, on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn, his head bare, and he shall uncover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. He shall be unclean. All the days he has the sore, he shall be unclean. He is unclean, and he shall dwell alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Verse 47, also if a garment has a leprous plague in it, whether it's a woolen garment or a linen garment, whether it's a warp or woof of linen or wool, whether in leather or in anything made of leather, and if the plague is greenish or reddish in the garment or in the leather, whether in the warp or in the woof, or in anything made of leather, it is a leprous plague, and shall be shown to the priest. The priest shall examine the plague and isolate that which has the plague 7 days, and he shall examine the plague on the seventh day. And if the plague is spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, in the leather or in anything made of leather, and the plague is an act of leprosy, it is unclean. He shall therefore burn that garment in which is the plague, whether warp or woof, in wool or in linen, or in anything of leather, for it is an act of leprosy. The garment shall be burned in the fire. But if the priest examines it, and indeed the plague has not spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, or in anything made of leather, then the priest shall command that they wash the thing which is in the plague, and he shall isolate it another 7 days. Then the priest shall examine the plague after it has been washed, and if the plague has not changed its color, if the plague is not spread, it is unclean, and you shall burn it in fire. It continues eating away, whether the damage is outside or inside. If the priest examines it, and indeed the plague has faded after washing it, then he shall tear it out of the garment, whether the warp or out of the woof, or out of any of the leather. But if it appears again in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, or in anything made of leather, it is a spreading plague. You shall burn it with fire, and that which is the plague. And if you wash the garment, either warp or woof, or whatever is made of leather, if the plague has disappeared from it, then it shall be washed a second time and shall be clean. This is the law of the leprous plague, in a garment of wool or linen, either in the warp or in the woof, or in anything made of leather, to pronounce it clean or to pronounce it unclean. And may the Lord add a blessing to the reading of his word. You may be seated. Starting last chapter, in chapter 12 through chapter 15, these are known as the purity laws of the book of Leviticus. And it recognizes what we all know is true, that we live in a world that is marked by decay, that is marked by death in every aspect of life. The purity laws acknowledge the challenge that humans face and provide a gracious answer that enables the people whose lives have been impacted by the decay or by death to be restored to proper worship of God. Through their healing, God has made these people whole again, alleviating them of the visual signs of decay, of death. In other words, he's made the unfit fit again. Now, as we've often noted as we read through the book of Leviticus, there is much there that to us in our modern day, since we are not living under these similar laws of ceremonial worship that it seems a little detached from us. But there are some things we need to understand in our passage that does apply to us. And what we want to understand is how, of course, is the application for us today. And the first thing we see is this is not just about leprosy. In fact, leprosy is a generic word we're going to discover. It has to do with any type of infection in this passage. If you have a burn and it turns into an infection, it's called leprosy in this passage. Not the leprosy that you or I have read about in the New Testament or have heard about in our modern day. Of course, the idea of leprosy today is actually a neurological disease condition where you lose your feelings starting in your extremities and moving on, which makes sense again because after all, people would wake up and they would burn themselves or harm their feet, or as we've read in, for example, in the New Testament times, rats eating fingers and people not knowing it because there's no feeling there. So you may easily burn yourself and not know you had grabbed something hot. You may have problems with your feet and not know it because you have no feeling. That's what we constitute as modern day leprosy, is a spread that takes place across the body and is seen in the skin. Now, what we understand in our passage here, though, is since leprosy is much more than just what we view as leprosy, this is an illustration for us. And the first thing we want to understand, number one, is that leprosy is an illustration of sin. Leprosy is an illustration of sin, and we see this throughout this passage. Now, understand also that not every country treated leprosy the same. In fact, in 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 through 15, we see the story of Naaman, who is a commander, a general in the army of Syria. Now, let me read it to you. 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given great victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper. And the Syrians had gone out on raids and brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. Then she said to her mistress, "If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would heal him of his leprosy." And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, "Thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Syria." Then the king of Syria said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, "Now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of leprosy." Verse 7, and when it happened, when the king of Israel read the letter, that he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me." So it was, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." Then Naaman went with his horses and chariots, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. Excuse me. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean." But Naaman became furious and went away and said, "Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and went away in a rage. And his servants came near and spoke to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you have not done it? How much more then when he says to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" And he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the sayings of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And he returned to the man of God, he and all his aides, and came and stood before him and said, Indeed, now I know that there is no God on all the earth except in Israel. Now therefore, please take a gift from your servant. See, not every country treated leprosy the same. Here was the commander of the army of Syria, who was a leper. So, in the story, Naaman is told by this little girl, this young girl, who was taken captive and becomes a slave, a servant to Naaman's wife, tells him about Elisha. He goes and shows up, and Elisha doesn't even come out the door. Sends his servant, who we'll find out his name is Gehazi, and says, tell the man to go to the Jordan, dip 7 times, and he'll be clean. And then tell him to go on. Naaman gets angry because you read, and as you heard in your reading, that he comes out and says, wait a minute. Am I not the general, the head of the army of Syria? I would expect him to at least come out and wave his hands a few times, call on the name of his God, and then maybe I'd be healed. What is this, just go into the river? You seen the Jordan? That's a dirty river. Aren't the rivers back in Syria a lot cleaner than this thing? I could have gotten dumped in that river and gotten clean, couldn't I? And it's his servants who turn to him and say, Naaman, if he had told you to go do this great feat, if he had told you to go slay certain people or go climb the highest mountain or do something, would you not have done it? What is it going to hurt to go dip yourself in the river 7 times? Fine. I'll go. I'll try it. And I picture in my mind Naaman as he walks into the river. It's as muddy and dirty, thinking, this is stupid. Why am I doing this? And he has to dip 7 times. He dips down once, gets up, looks at himself, thinking nothing. Twice, 3, 4, 5 times. He probably turns to his servants and goes, this has got to be the most idiotic thing I've ever heard of. And I can picture servants going, Naaman, General, he said 7 times, you've only done 5. Come on, you're already here. Just go ahead and do it. Goes down the 6th time going, I told you nothing has changed. Absolutely nothing. General, 1 more time. Then if you want to go back and attack his village, go ahead. But he dips down and he comes back up, and on the 7th time, the scripture says, his flesh had changed into the flesh of a baby. And Naaman responds with a simple statement that he goes back and he says, now I know there is no God except the God of Israel. What we discover is he offers all kinds of money to Elisha. Elisha tells him, no, I don't take any money. And he just asks for a favor. Can I please, my king is going to require me to go when he worships before his God, his idol. Would I be allowed not to offend him, but at least go with him in some way, shape, or form? And Elisha says, go ahead and go. And what we discover later is that he grabs some dirt and takes it with him, and he's going to worship on that ground. But he goes, and as he's leaving, Gehazi's thinking to himself, this is stupid, we could have been rich. He chases down Naaman and asks for money. The prophet changed his mind, he'd like all that money now. Gehazi gets found out. It's a sad story. You can read the rest of it yourself. But the point here is, Syria, they did not treat lepers as they did in Israel. And the purity laws here that have to do with this leprosy show us the matter of holiness of God, and that it pervades every aspect of our life. Holiness today is considered by so many people to be nothing more than good behavior. All you have to do is go by the established moral code in context of whatever religious practice you have. But the concept of holiness is fundamentally a description of your personal relationship with the only one and truly holy Lord God. The relationship with God was the result of the redemption provided by his people. But notice something here. And how do we know this is more than just has to do with a physical malady? Who when someone has a burn, when someone has a sore spot, when someone has a scab, when someone has a physical condition, who do they go see? They go see the priest, not a physician. You get sick. You have a physical problem. You get injured. Are you going to call me and say, hey, pastor, come look at my boil. Come look at my wound. Tell me what you think. You'd be silly. I know you're thinking, well, but you're a doctor. Yeah, not that kind. But here's the issue. You'd go to a doctor. They had physicians. They had people that knew basic medicine. Granted, it'd be mostly an herbal type medicine, not compounded drugs that we have today. But they would know if you had a burn, you make this poultice or this powdery or weeds or what have you, and put it on the burn to help the infection, to help it heal. They knew all of that. Why did they not go see a doctor? Because this is an illustration of holiness, which is an illustration, leprosy is being an illustration of sin. Now, why else do we know this? Well, the Hebrew is tzara'ath. You're thinking, yeah, I knew that. It means leprous. Yes, you're right. But remember, it also came from tzara, which means to scourge, to strike down, and is often used in the idea of to be stricken down by God. See, leprosy was deemed a divine infliction. And so if not divinely cured, would be fatal. It's an illustration of sin because we are stricken, we are scourged with sin, and it is fatal. How else do we also know? Look at verse 7 and 8 of Leviticus 13. It says, but if the scab should at all spread over the skin, and after he has been seen by the priest for his cleansing, he shall be seen by the priest again. And if the priest sees the scab is indeed spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. You realize how much sin spreads? Sin is never really done in isolation. It infects your whole life. We may think I can keep it over here, and I can keep it over here, and I can keep it in a box, and I can keep it with its borders, but you can't. And again, after he's been declared clean, he goes back to the priest after he's been cleansed, and the priest redeclares him unclean once again, because sin spreads. What do we also know about this as an illustration of sin? Secondly, number 2, the penalty was a living death. The penalty was a living death. Look at verses 45 and 46. Now the leper, on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn and his head bare, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. He shall be unclean. All the days he has the sore, he shall be unclean. He is unclean, and he shall dwell alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. You realize he used to be his own chief mourner? Do you know that back here, the idea of mourning when something happened, and we saw that in our reading of 2 Kings, that you tear your clothes, you shave your head, you make your head bare, you might throw dirt or ashes on yourself in an act of mourning. So if you have a loved one that dies, that's what you do. You tear your clothes, you uncover your head, you do all these different things. Here is what the leper is to do. He's to be his own chief mourner. And this really is an illustration of what spiritual death is. He's to walk around, cover his mustache, in other words, his hand over his mouth. And he's to say, unclean, unclean, which he's reminding people of personal uncleanness. And then ultimately, what does it tell us? He is unclean. He shall dwell alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. He's to be in isolation from the tabernacle, from the camp, from everyone else. It's a picture of being isolated from God. You are not allowed in the tabernacle. You are not allowed among the people of God. You have spiritual death. You're to be your own mourner because you are dead and you don't know it. Look at verse 47. Also, if a garment has a leprous plague in it, whether it's a woolen garment or a linen garment. Not only is leprosy an illustration of sin, not only was the penalty a living death, but number 3, they were dealing with impure surroundings. Impure surroundings. What ends up happening? Just quickly this morning. What do we see ends up taking place? They are to examine the surroundings, in this case the garment. They are to examine the surroundings. They are to make a very serious effort to cleanse their surroundings, to make them clean once again. But if that does not happen, destroy it. Destroy what causes the impurity. Wipe it out. What we might say is get it out of your life. See, whatever the cost, remove it from your life. They could sit back and say, but I don't have that many garments. They could say, but I can't afford new clothes. They could say, but it's still in style. This is not last year's tunic. It's this year's. You notice the cut and the flow. But they're to remove it from their life. They are to destroy it completely. Burn it in the fire. Don't just cut it out. Destroy it. We read much of leprosy in the Scripture. But just remember, when you do, it isn't just always referring to a disease. Yes, there are times it is. But it isn't always referring to just a single disease. As we've already read, it has to do with infection. It has to do with decay. It has to do with all these different things. And if you read your notes, if you have a study Bible and you read the notes ever so often, they will tell you this means infection, this means this means that. Not just a single solitary disease. But it's sure an illustration of sin. It infects, it spreads, it can cause a living death, and you're often dealing with impure surroundings. Cleanse yourself and cleanse your surroundings and be clean. Let's sing one last time. 514. Number 514. Stand with me if you will, please.